I am Professor Dr. Chandrashekara, a rheumatologist. In next couple of minutes, I will take you through to understand why, how autoimmunity develops in us. We are protected by a policing system, what we call it as immune system. Basically, immune system protects us against infection as well as from varieties of diseases. It is all pervasive system. It's almost present in every part and every corner of the body, either in the form of cells, proteins, or sometimes even the cells which otherwise don't have a function of immune system do switch themselves to have one or other role with reference to immune system or functions as a part or component of immune system in emergency. The system has been designed and devised to protect the organism, the humans, against infectious diseases, against environment pollutions, and etc. In addition to that, it also maintains the health of an individual overall. It helps in healing of the wound, it helps in clearing the debris, it helps in clearing the dead wounds or dead tissues inside an injury or an injured part. As I said earlier, the basic invaders against which the immune system fights are predominantly bacteria, viruses, parasites which are multicellular, environment pollutants, sometimes harmful proteins like poisons and others, and even an injury which causes a lot of debris, the other damaged tissues which occupies or being present in those areas are the things which the immune system tries to attack, clear them from the host. Immune system is divided into two major components. One is innate immune response or innate immunity. Another one is an acquired or adaptive immunity. Innate immunity includes the mucous membrane, skin, some of the structures which directly protects the entire organism from the external environment. In addition to that, we have varieties of cells called neutrophils, monocytes, macrophages, which the moment they sense that there is some bacteria, some debris or any other parts, they come in action. They don't have any specific signals, they don't identify bacteria or viruses, but they respond quickly and immediately to clear those organisms or clear those pollutant particles from the tissues. Whereas acquired or adaptive immunity is specific to virus or specific to bacteria or specific to proteins. It usually come into action after a certain point of time. They don't get prepared immediately unless the host has been pre-exposed to the same virus or bacteria. This is where we use vaccine. If I give a vaccine, if I sensitize the host for some of the viruses, at that point of time, the acquired or adaptive immunity is already prepared, already tutored, or trained to identify these viruses, and they respond quickly and immediately. So the difference in innate immune response is usually they are not very specific, they don't remember, they don't have any memory. Whereas in acquired or adaptive immunity, they remember the virus or the bacteria, the response is specific to those viruses and bacteria, and they are formed only after exposure to them. They are not present from the birth, they are not non-specific, they are very specific to the microorganism which it affects or which it involves. Immune system can have a possible three defects. One, it may not be working adequately, what we call as immunodeficiency. It may be overreacting to a stimulus, what we call as hypersensitive reaction. What we mean is, if it responds to a protein, innate particle, say for example pollen, which is not going to harm the host, but it reacts as if it is going to harm the host, we call it as allergy. That is what we call as hypersensitivity. Or even a response to an infection more than required to clear the organism is also called hypersensitivity. The next error that happens in immune system is what we call as autoimmunity, wherein the immune system, especially the acquired or an adaptive immune responses, including sometimes the innate immune responses, attacks self and causes the damage to self. That's a point where we call it as autoimmunity. This is not a new concept. This has evolved as early as Paul Ehrlich's time in 1800s. That's a time when Paul Ehrlich predicted a possibility of autoimmunity, which he called it as horror autotoxicus. Self-toxin or a self-damaging is something which almost can go like an horror or an horrifying episode, which itself can kill the patient or damage the patient. So autoimmunity is not a new concept. Autoimmunity is not a new disease. It's there, it was prevalent from the time human exists, but this identification was little late, and we have understood about autoimmunity much more than what it used to be in the earlier days. One of the major questions which always creeps into the mind is, what causes this autoimmunity? Why a system which is designed by the nature to protect self, protect me, can cause harm to myself? Why does immune system, which otherwise a protector, becomes a killer? These are the questions which always comes to anybody's mind, because in the initial stage when we discovered immune system, we believed, and we even now we believe, that the immune system is designed in such a manner to figure out what is self and figure out what is non-self, and to fight against non-self and clear the non-self particulate matter, which like bacteria, viruses, and then only cause harm to self. So it is not expected to identify self protein and cause harm to self. However, error can happen, and error does happen, and it was more than what we expected in the initial stage. Initially we thought it may be very rare. Slowly we realized it could be 1%. Now we have realized approximately around 10 to 14% of the population suffer from one or other variety of autoimmune response, out of which luckily only 3 to 7% of them gets converted into a definable autoimmune disease where we need intervention or treatment. So why does the autoimmune response occurs? One possible theory, and one of the possibility, is there could be a confusion because of subtle difference. As we know, especially the biology students may be knowing, that all of us are made out of few amino acids and few protein substances, few of the organic materials. Thus being the case, the bacteria, viruses, and some of the parasites may have certain of the proteins which is conserved or preserved in its shape and formation. We may have some structure which resembles the bacteria or viruses. In this confusion of attacking, immune system may mount a reaction or a response on a self. Though it tries to distinguish between self and non-self by variety of mechanisms, there is a possibility, because of this similarity, the immune system, in an attempt to fight against the external proteins, external parasites or bacteria, may fire on self. And this is what can happen in any army. Sometimes if the uniform looks same, there is a possibility of shooting your own soldiers or your own people. So this is not something unusual. This is expected. Then this is said to be one of the mechanisms how an autoimmune disease or autoimmune process may get triggered. The next possibility is a confusion in the targets. Like for example, the infective agents may have some protein which cross-react with another protein which is present in self. Or sometime it may identify or figure out a cell which has been as if it has been infected. Or sometime the infected cell, when it is going to eliminate that cell, may pick it up as an antigen or a protein or as something which is non-self and may start shooting up on these particular proteins. So the confusion of the target confusing like infective agents, environmental, other simulators may confuse the immune system to mount an immune response against some of the self proteins. One of the best example we have is a rheumatic fever where the antibodies are developed against the streptococcal protein, which cross reacts with some of the proteins which are present in the heart, some of the proteins which are present in the joint, resulting in rheumatic fever both in joint as well as damage being caused in the heart. So like that, there is a confusion in the target resulting in a sort of self-inflicting injuries. Another mechanism which may be responsible is some of these viruses, bacteria may stimulate the immune system in such a manner it may start producing the every repertoire. Most of the immune system has some amount of recognizable sequence or a recognizable what we can call it for easy to understand, a sort of a groove which you see in the key, sort of that arrangement would be there, which could also be on the some of the self protein, some of the protein which cross react with the self. When some viruses come and stimulate the immune system may be so badly stimulated, can release the antibodies against most of the proteins which include or which may exclude the virus itself. So this we call it as polyclonal stimulation, as if you are standing in a place where it just throws out everything as one of the antibodies. A self could be, there could be some self reacting, there could be some which are reacting against some of the memorized bacteria and viruses. So it may just push out a sort of antibodies, what we call as polyclonal stimulation, which may over a period of time may develop into an autoimmunity or an autoimmune disease. Other factors like genes may also influence the development of autoimmune disease. For a best example we have is HLA-B27, which we see in 87% of the patients who develop ankylosing spondylitis. And here it's not that everyone who carries this gene HLA-B27 will develop the disease. 1 out of 10 or 10% of the people who carry the gene will develop ankylosing spondylitis. That's why we don't like to call autoimmune disease as a 100% hereditary disease. The disease which in the presence of a gene, what we call as a gene which has a predisposition to develop the autoimmune disease in its presence. When the environment pushes for the development of the disease, one may develop ankylosing spondylitis. Like we have identified several genes like DR2 with multiple sclerosis, DR3 with systemic lupus erythematosus, and DR5 with reference to Hashimoto thyroiditis. We have different genes which could identify or be associated with variety of diseases. In addition to that, we also see the autoimmune disease to be little more commoner in women compared to men. It is said to be the reason because the female hormones is supposed to generate or push some of the autoantibody production. It's also said that the woman has an immune system to adopt or accommodate a pregnancy, as a result of which there are certain loose ends because of which there is a possibility of developing autoimmune disease. It's often said that she takes the risk of autoimmune disease for sake of continuity of progeny. But how far it is correct, how far it is a point, we need to work on that. But we do see that females have a higher tendency to develop autoimmune disease. It is said to be because of hormones as well as varieties of other factors. One another cause for autoimmunity is said to be because of the sequestrated antigens. Sometimes the proteins which are there in the eyes, which are present in the brain, are not normally supervised or surveillanced by the immune system. They are called privileged site. Since these proteins are not normally exposed to the immune system, there may or they may not have been desensitized by the immune system to recognize it as self. As a result of which, when an injury occurs to these areas or these parts, for example, When eye gets injured, say the left eye, the right eye develops sometime what we call as sympathetic ophthalmitis. That is expected to occur since the proteins in the eyes are released into the immune system circulation. They identify them as a foreign protein and start attacking a healthy eye. So this all also occurs as a result of what we call as immunologically privileged site, from where a protein which is otherwise isolated from the immune system surveillance can also be one of the reasons why we develop autoimmunity. Based on how the disease develops, we group the autoimmune disease into two major groups. One is what we call as organ specific, which is targeted to specific organs. For example, autoimmune thyroid disease, which is very commonly we call it as thyroid bandide, thyroid has come. So this is what we call as hypothyroidism. In hypothyroidism, patient have a damaged thyroid as a consequence of autoimmune disease. Similarly, if it is involving the muscle and skeletal system, there is an entity called myasthenia gravis. When it is only blood, that especially red blood cells, we call it as autoimmune hemolytic anemia. In the same way, when it is not targeted against any specific organ, like what happens in rheumatoid arthritis, it's only not just the joint, it could be other tissues like skin, it can affect lung, it can affect multiple organs. Similarly, SLE, vasculitis, we call them as organ non-specific or systemic autoimmune disease. So just to understand, how does these autoantibodies or self-reacting things can produce a problem? For example, in Graves' disease, there is an antibody what we call as thyroid stimulating hormone receptor. They produce excessive functioning or working of thyroid, what produces hyperthyroidism. Similarly, we have an antibody which blocks the acetylcholine receptor. Here, it causes progressive weakness because it blocks the transmitter which moves from nerves to the muscle, responsible for the production of muscle movement. Similarly, in diabetes mellitus, what we call as insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, they damages insulin receptor and can produce varieties of symptoms. So antibodies can activate a receptor, can destroy the receptor, can damage the tissue and organs. Like that, because of the multiple sites and multiple potentialities, antibodies can work. So also some of the cells like T cells, B cells and varieties of immune regulatory cells becomes active because of the presence of self-reacting inflammation, which causes progressive damages to the tissues. Once one antigen or one protein in the self gets identified, slowly it can step into more and more proteins. What I mean is, for example, it identifies protein A or say dsDNA. Next, it can identify single strand DNA. Next, it can identify a protein adjacent to that. Like that, the autoimmune response or a autoantibody which starts with one can slowly move into multiple sites. So this is what we call as antigen spreading, and this is one of the reason why if we come late in autoimmune diseases, more likely we will have more number of and more possibility of autoimmune processes. In addition, immune system has been built to become better and better as it attacks the same site. In a sense, it learns to attack, damage or cause injuries much more better to the invading organ. That's why we use adaptive immune system rather than the innate immune system. So this improvement can also be hazardous when it is attacking self. So what I mean is, a thief may become better and better with his experience. More he steals, more he steals, more he becomes better. So also a self-reaction, as it is inherent in the immune system, it becomes better and better as the time progresses. That's why early identification of autoimmune disease and treatment has a better outcome compared to a delayed identification and delayed treatment. So the autoimmune disease needs a quicker identification because it can spread, it can improvise, it can become worse. As the time progresses, things may become worse even in autoimmune disease. The autoimmune process would have penetrated much deeper to cause more injuries. So what can trigger autoimmunity? As I said, it could be pollution, include smoking, it could be infection, it could be stress, both psychological and physiological, or it could just be accidental. By chance, the immune system may figure out some of the self proteins. So there are varieties of things which can trigger autoimmunity. The autoimmunity trigger may be of not relevance when we start treating the patient, with an exception, because the treatment depends on the type of autoimmunity, what is the process that it is damaging, what organs it are likely to cause, and based on that the treatment strategies depends. So but anyway, for theoretical reason, one need to remember that pollution, infection, stress, both psychological and physiological, may trigger an autoimmunity, but most often it could be just an accident. There are few queries, few thoughts. Can food cause autoimmunity? Answer to that most of the time, no. Food can cause hypersensitivity. You may get allergy to a food item, but you may not get an autoimmunity triggered by food. Is non-vegetarian causes autoimmunity? Answer to that question is also a hard no, because it is not unique to non-vegetarian. Both vegetarian, even for that matter pure vegans, can get autoimmune reactions. Losing sleep, stress, strain, so much of things. It's not just a cause of it, it could be contributing but may not be the reason for triggering the autoimmune disease. So that being the case, altering food, changing from vegetarian to non-vegetarian, switching from here to there, sleeping excess, taking rest is not going to change a once triggered autoimmunity. So, but we need to remember some amount of psychological stress can cause it, but it's not the only reason for the development of autoimmunity. So that being the case, we need to figure out and identify autoimmunity. I have explained you the varieties and methods in which one can develop autoimmunity. I have explained how and why we develop an autoimmunity, why an autoimmune diseases should be identified early, and how we should go about it, following which you will have a series of videos which will explain about organ specific and non-organ specific autoimmune diseases. Please listen to them. Try to understand what is autoimmunity, how shall I get over that, and how one can identify and treat early, which will give a better outcome. Thank you very much for patience.